There's a barn in Addison County, Vermont. It was built in 1823. The main beams that hold up the entire structure, the ones carrying the weight of 2 centuries of hay and equipment and snow loads that would crush a modern building, they're still perfectly solid. No rot, no twist, no sag. You can run your hand across that timber and feel the surface. Still tight, still sealed, still doing exactly what it was made to do 200 years ago. Half a mile down the road, there's another barn. This one was built in 2004. The owner used dimensional lumber from the local building supply store. Standard 2x12s and 4x6s. Modern wood, kiln-dried, stamped with grade marks, supposedly engineered for structural use. The rafters are already sagging. The joists have twisted. There's rot creeping in where moisture found its way into the end grain. 20 years old, and it's already failing. So here's the question that should bother you. How is it possible that timber cut and shaped by hand over 200 years ago outlasts lumber produced by modern sawmills with all our technology and precision and quality control? What did those old builders know that we've forgotten? What did they do differently? The answer isn't complicated. It isn't some lost secret or ancient mystical technique. The answer is one tool: a 12-inch blade, an offset handle, a swing that took years to master. Every barn beam, every cabin wall, every covered bridge timber, every ship hull plank, every railroad tie in America before 1870 was shaped by this single instrument. It was called the broadaxe, and the men who wielded it built a nation that still stands on their work today. This is the story of that tool, and this is the story of the hands that held it. Picture yourself standing in a Massachusetts forest in 1742. You're a farmer named Elijah Whitcomb, 26 years old. You've got 40 acres of land granted to you by the colony, and on paper, that sounds like wealth. 40 acres. Enough to build a life, raise a family, pass something down to your children. But you're standing in the middle of it right now, and what you see isn't farmland. What you see is trees. White pines so thick you can barely walk between them. Oak and maple crowding every inch of soil. Your 40 acres might as well be 40 acres of solid rock for all the good it does you. Because before you can plant a single seed, before you can graze a single cow, before you can even build the house your wife is waiting for, you have to turn those trees into something useful. And here's what most people don't understand about that moment. The trees aren't the problem. You can fell a tree. That's hard work, but it's straightforward. Swing an axe, make a notch, swing some more, the tree comes down. The problem is what happens after. You're standing over a white pine that took 2 hours to fell. It's lying on the forest floor, 60 feet long, 3 feet thick at the base, round as a barrel. And you need to turn this irregular cylinder of raw wood into flat, square timbers that can be stacked, joined, pegged together to make the frame of a house. You need boards to cover the walls. You need beams to hold up the roof. You need joists to support the floors. And every single piece has to be flat, has to be square, has to be true. In 1742, you've got 3 options, and none of them are good. The first option is a pit saw. This is a 6-foot blade with a handle on each end. You dig a pit in the ground, 6 feet deep, then roll the log over it on a frame. One man stands on top, while another man stands in the pit below. The man on top pulls the saw up. The man in the pit pulls it down. Back and forth, inch by inch, you rip that log into boards. A pit saw team, working hard, could produce maybe 50 board feet in a full day of labor. That's enough to cover about 4 square feet of wall. Your house needs something like 3,000 board feet of lumber. Do the math. 2 men, working every day that weather permits, for 2 solid months. Just for the boards. Just for the covering. That's before you even touch the heavy timbers for the frame. And the pit man? The one standing below? He spent his days in a hole, sawdust raining down on him every minute. It coated his lungs. It crusted in his eyes. It filled his nose and mouth until he was coughing up wood by nightfall. The pit man breathed sawdust with every stroke. A pit man aged fast. A pit man died young. There's a reason nobody wanted that job. There's a reason it was given to the lowest men in the community, to the desperate, to the ones with no other options. The second option is to haul your logs to a water-powered sawmill, if there happens to be one within 20 miles of your land. In 1742, in most of colonial America, there isn't. And even if there is, you'll pay the miller. You'll wait your turn behind every other farmer who had the same idea. You'll spend weeks getting your timber there and back, hauling it over roads that are really just muddy trails, while your wife and children sleep under canvas and wait for you to build them a home. The third option is the one that actually built America. You stand that log up on blocks. You snap a chalk line down its length, marking where you want the flat surface to be. You take your felling axe and you chop notches along that line, every 8 inches or so, cutting down to the depth where you want the finished surface. And then you pick up your broadaxe. The broadaxe doesn't look like a weapon. It looks like something designed for exactly one purpose, which is what it was. The blade is 12 inches across, sometimes 14, sometimes more on the big ones. The steel is thick and heavy, but the edge is ground sharp enough to shave with. And that edge is only on one side, like a chisel scaled up to monstrous proportions. The handle is the crucial part. On a regular axe, the handle runs straight back from the head. On a broad axe, the handle is offset. It curves away from the blade, bending at an angle. This allows you to swing the axe along the side of a timber while keeping your hands clear of the surface. You stand on top of that log, your feet planted on the wood itself, finding balance on the curve, and you swing the broadaxe down along the side, shearing off those notched sections, slice by slice, until what was round becomes flat. The motion is called hewing. It's not chopping, it's not cutting, it's shearing. The blade comes down at a shallow angle, and instead of biting deep into the wood, it peels away a layer. Each stroke removes a slice maybe half an inch thick, maybe an inch if you're aggressive. The chips fly off to the side. The surface that remains is smooth, almost polished. Then you flip the log, do the other side, then roll it over to do the top, then the bottom. What emerges is a squared timber, flat faces, sharp corners, ready to be joined with other timbers using mortise and tenon joints, the same joinery that's held buildings together since ancient Rome. Here's what a skilled hewer could do. A man who'd spent 5 years learning the broadaxe, who'd graduated from small stuff to big timbers, who knew the tool like he knew his own hands. That man could produce 40 to 50 feet of squared timber in a single day, working alone, no pit, no partner, no mill. Elijah Whitcomb needed roughly 60 heavy timbers to frame his house. Sills, posts, plates, beams, rafters, braces. Call it 2,000 linear feet of squared wood. With a pit saw, that's 4 months of work minimum, assuming he can find someone to stand in the pit with him. With a broadaxe, it's 6 weeks. Maybe less if the weather holds and the wood is good. That's not a marginal difference. That's the difference between building a house before winter and watching your family freeze in a canvas tent. But here's the part that matters more than speed. Here's the part that explains why that 1823 barn in Vermont is still standing, while the 2004 barn is already falling apart. This is the science that the old craftsmen understood intuitively, even if they couldn't have explained it in modern terms. When a saw cuts through wood, it tears the fibers. Picture running a blade through a bundle of drinking straws. The saw rips through, and every straw it touches is left open, exposed. The ends of those fibers are now tiny channels, perfect for absorbing moisture. Water gets in. Water brings fungus. Fungus brings rot. Rot brings failure. The more you cut with a saw, the more channels you open. Modern dimensional lumber is sawn on all four sides, every surface torn open at the cellular level. When a broadaxe cuts through wood, it does something completely different. The blade doesn't tear, it compresses. The weight of that heavy steel head, combined with the sharp edge coming in at an angle, shears the fibers and presses them closed in the same motion. Run your hand across a hand-hewn timber from the 1700s. The surface isn't rough like sawn wood. It's almost burnished, almost sealed. Those compressed fibers resist water penetration the way modern lumber never can. The broadaxe doesn't just shape the wood, it armor plates it against the elements. I've spent time in the archives, looking at preservation studies of colonial-era structures. The data is remarkable. Hand-hewn timbers in buildings that were never painted, never treated, never protected in any way except by the compression of the broadaxe cut, those timbers show moisture content levels half of what you find in modern sawn lumber stored in the same conditions. Half the moisture, half the opportunity for rot. That's why the 1823 barn is still standing. That's why you can find hand-hewn beams in buildings across New England, across Virginia, across Pennsylvania, still doing their job after 200 years. The men who wielded those broadaxes might not have understood wood science. They didn't have microscopes to examine fiber structure. But they knew. They knew that hewn timber lasted longer than sawn timber. They knew their work would stand. And they were right. Now let me tell you about the men who did this work. In the village of Deerfield, Massachusetts, there's a historical society that keeps some of the old records. Town ledgers, tax rolls, estate inventories, church records of births, marriages, deaths. I spent 3 days going through those documents, looking for mentions of hewers and their trade. What I found was a man named Josiah Barnard. Josiah Barnard was born in Deerfield in 1711. His father was a farmer with a small holding, maybe 20 acres of cleared land. Not enough to split among 3 sons. So Josiah apprenticed to a joiner and housewright named Thomas Wells at the age of 14. For 7 years, Josiah learned the building trade. The apprenticeship records show the progression. He started with simple work, cutting pegs and smoothing boards with a hand plane. By 16, he was allowed to handle the broadaxe on small timbers under close supervision. By 18, he was squaring minor beams on his own. By 20, he was working major timbers. By 21, when his apprenticeship ended, he could take a 20-foot oak log and turn it into a perfect squared timber in under 3 hours. The ledger records show that Josiah Barnard worked on at least 40 buildings between 1732 and 1761. Houses, barns, a meeting house, a mill. His account book, fragments of which survive, lists payments received and materials purchased. £1.06 for hewing the frame timbers of the Williams house. £2 for the barn at the north end of town. 3s 6 for a day's work on the meeting house repairs. The Deerfield historian I spoke with estimated that Barnard personally hewed something like 15,000 linear feet of timber in his career. 15,000 feet. Shaped one swing at a time, sealed by the blade of his broadaxe. At least 3 of those buildings still exist. One of them, a farmhouse built in 1747, is still occupied. A family lives there today. They cook breakfast in a kitchen supported by timbers that Josiah Barnard squared with his hands 277 years ago. I found another hewer in the records from Virginia. His name was George Randolph. No relation to the famous family, just a common craftsman from Henrico County. George Randolph worked the tobacco plantations along the James River in the 1750s and 1760s, building curing barns and outbuildings for the planters. The plantation records are more detailed than the New England town ledgers. They show that Randolph employed a crew of 4 men, including 2 enslaved workers whose names were Jupiter and Cato. The records list them by first name only, as property, But they were hewers too. They stood on those logs in the Virginia heat, swinging broadaxes, building structures that would enrich men who owned them. George Randolph's crew built at least 12 tobacco barns that I can trace in the records. Several of them survived into the 20th century. One of them, on what's now a historic property near Richmond, was documented by a preservation society in 1934. The photographs show the hewn beams, still sound, still bearing the marks of the broadaxe after nearly 200 years. Jupiter and Cato built those beams. Their skill preserved that wood. And for their work, they received nothing. Not wages, not freedom, not even the dignity of a last name in the records. That's the history of the broadaxe in America. It's not just a story of skill. It's a story of who got credit and who got forgotten. The broadaxe wasn't just for houses and barns. The tool that built domestic America also built industrial America, and nowhere was this more evident than on the railroads. In 1850, there were 9,000 miles of railroad track in the United States. By 1870, there were 53,000 miles. By 1900, there were nearly 200,000 miles. The expansion was explosive, almost incomprehensible in scale. Every mile of track required approximately 3,000 ties, thick timbers, roughly 6 by 8 inches, 8 feet long, laid crosswise under the rails to distribute the weight and hold the gauge. Millions and millions of ties. An endless appetite for squared wood. The early railroads tried everything. They tried laying track directly on stone. The stone cracked from the vibration of passing trains. They tried iron supports, far too expensive to scale. They tried round logs. The rails wouldn't seat properly, and the whole track wobbled and shifted. What they needed was squared timber, flat on top and bottom, so the rails would seat true. And in the 1840s and 1850s, before the big steam-powered sawmills came online, the only way to get squared timber at the scale the railroads demanded was the broadaxe. Railroad tie hacking became its own profession. Crews of men moved through the forests of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, dropping trees and squaring ties at a pace that would have astonished the colonial housewrights. This wasn't fine work. This wasn't building for the ages. This was production, raw and relentless. A good tie hacker could produce 30 to 40 ties in a day. That's not elegant joinery. That's not furniture-grade timber. But it was fast, and it was good enough. And it was the only way to keep up with the locomotives pushing west. I found records of a tie hacking crew that worked the forests of eastern Ohio in 1854. The crew was led by a man named William Dunlap, an Irish immigrant who had learned the broadaxe trade back in County Cork before coming to America in 1847, just ahead of the worst of the famine. Dunlap's crew consisted of 14 men. They camped in the woods from April to November, moving from tract to tract as they exhausted the available timber. They slept in canvas tents. They cooked over open fires. They worked 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, with only Sunday for rest. In 7 months, that crew produced over 28,000 railroad ties, 28,000 pieces of squared timber, enough to lay more than 9 miles of track. From the sweat of 14 men and 14 broadaxes. The railroad company paid them 40 cents per tie. That sounds like nothing, but in 1854, 40 cents was a meaningful sum. Work it out, and each man cleared something like $800 for the season. That was good money. Better than farming. Better than mill work. Better than almost anything else a working man could do. But the railroad company turned around and sold those ties to the construction crews at $1 each, taking their profit on the spread. The 9 miles of track those ties enabled connected 2 towns and opened up thousands of acres of farmland for development. The land values along that route increased by factors of 5, 10, 20. William Dunlap and his crew captured a fraction of the value they created. They always did. The men who did the heaviest, most dangerous, most essential work were the ones who saw the smallest share of the wealth. The pattern repeated across every frontier, every industry, every era. And the work was dangerous. Make no mistake about that. The broadaxe is not a forgiving tool. The blade is wide and heavy and sharp enough to take off a foot with a single misplaced swing. The work is done standing on top of a round log, balanced on a curved surface, often wet with sap or rain, swinging a 3-pound blade inches from your own feet. I found death records. They're scattered, incomplete, buried in county archives and church registers, but they're there if you look. Isaac Pratt, age 22, Granville County, North Carolina, 1798, died from a broadaxe wound to the leg that severed the femoral artery. He bled out in the forest before his fellow workers could get him to help. He'd been hewing timber for a tobacco barn. The coroner's report notes that he left behind a wife and infant daughter. Jeremiah Foster, age 34, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, 1821. The coroner's report says he slipped while standing on a wet log during an October rain. The axe glanced off a knot in the wood and cut through his boot into his ankle, shattering the bone and opening a deep wound. Infection set in within days. He lasted 9 days before the fever took him. He left behind 5 children. Samuel Briggs, age 19, Albany County, New York, 1844. Killed when a squared timber rolled during moving operations. He was positioning it for transport, working with a peavey to rotate the heavy beam when it shifted unexpectedly. The edge caught him across the chest. 19 years old. His father had taught him the trade. His father had to bury him. These weren't rare events. These were the ordinary risks of a trade that required standing on an unstable surface while swinging a razor-sharp blade. Every hewer knew men who had died. Every hewer had scars. The experienced ones developed rituals, superstitions, safety practices passed down from master to apprentice. Never hew with the sun in your eyes. Always check your footing before every swing. If a log feels wrong, if it shifts or creaks or settles under your weight, step off immediately and re-chalk it. Never rush. Never get careless. The broadaxe doesn't give second chances. But even the careful ones died. Even the experienced ones. A moment of inattention. A hidden defect in the wood. A patch of ice on a winter morning. A bee sting that made a man flinch at exactly the wrong moment. And a craftsman who had spent years mastering his trade was gone, leaving behind a family and a half-finished timber. Let me tell you what the broadaxe actually built. Not in general terms, but specifically. Let me tell you what that one tool made possible. Every timber frame house in America before 1850. That's hundreds of thousands of structures, many of them still standing today. The hewn beams in New England's salt box houses, the massive posts in Virginia plantation homes, the barn frames across the entire eastern seaboard, all of it shaped by broadaxes in the hands of craftsmen who took pride in their work. Every covered bridge in America. There are fewer than 1,000 covered bridges left today, scattered across Pennsylvania and Vermont and Oregon and a handful of other states. But there used to be thousands of them, spanning rivers and creeks across the country. The main structural timbers in those bridges were hewn from single trees, sometimes 40 feet long, sometimes weighing 2,000 pounds or more. Men shaped those timbers standing on top of them, swinging broadaxes, knowing that a mistake meant falling into the river or onto the rocks below. Every wooden ship hull built in American shipyards before the 1870s. The keel, the ribs, the planking, the deck beams. Oak and pine and cedar, hewn to precise dimensions, fitted together with a tolerance measured in fractions of an inch. Consider what it took to build a single merchant ship. The keel alone might be 80 feet long, hewn from a single great oak or scarfed together from 2 or 3 massive timbers. The ribs, curved to match the hull shape, required a special skill. The shipwright's broadaxe was different from a housewright's. The blade curved slightly to match the contours of the hull. A man had to learn to hew on a curve, following the natural bend of a compass timber while keeping the surface true. I found records from the Sprague Shipyard in Bath, Maine. In 1848, they built a three-masted schooner called the Northern Light. The hull required over 600 individual hewn timbers, not counting the planking. 23 men worked the broadaxes for that ship. It took them 4 months just to prepare the framing stock before the actual construction could begin. The Northern Light sailed for 31 years. 31 years of Atlantic storms and Caribbean hurricanes, and the constant assault of salt water on wood. When she was finally broken up in 1879, the surveyors noted that the hewn keel timbers were still sound, still solid, still capable of carrying a cargo, if the rest of the ship hadn't worn out around them. That's what hand-hewn timber could do. That's what the broadaxe made possible. Every wharf and dock along the Atlantic coast, the massive pilings driven into the harbor mud, the deck beams laid over them, the bollards where ships tied fast. Hewn timber, resistant to salt water, resistant to rot, lasting decades under conditions that would destroy modern lumber in years. Every church steeple that rose above every colonial town, every mill frame that held the grinding stones, every warehouse that stored the goods of a growing nation, every market hall where farmers sold their produce. The broadaxe built America. Not one part of it, all of it. From Maine to Georgia, from the coast to the frontier, every structure that needed heavy timber was built by men with broadaxes in their hands. And then, over the course of a few decades, it stopped. The change didn't happen overnight. It happened in stages, driven by technology, driven by economics, driven by the relentless American demand for more, faster, cheaper. In 1800, a water-powered sawmill could cut maybe 500 board feet of lumber per day. That's better than a pit saw, certainly, but not dramatically better than a skilled broadaxe team that could produce squared timbers directly without the intermediate step of sawing boards. By 1850, steam-powered sawmills were cutting 5,000 board feet per day, 10 times the output, and they didn't need a river to power them. They could be built anywhere there was fuel for the boiler. By 1870, the big bandsaws and circular saws could cut 20,000 board feet per day, 40 times what the water mills had produced, 100 times what a pit saw team could manage. The math stopped working for the broadaxe. It didn't matter that hand-hewn timber lasted longer. It didn't matter that the broadaxe sealed the wood against moisture. It didn't matter that the craft represented generations of accumulated knowledge, passed from master to apprentice. What mattered was that a sawmill could produce timber 10 times faster and sell it for half the price. What mattered was that a farmer could walk into a lumber yard and buy finished boards instead of waiting weeks for a hewer to square his timber. What mattered was speed and cost and convenience. The railroads that broadaxe crews had made possible by hewing millions of ties, those same railroads now carried machine-sawn lumber from massive sawmills to every corner of the country. The infrastructure that the hewers built became the mechanism of their own obsolescence. By 1890, you could still find old men who knew the broadaxe. They worked on special jobs where hand-hewn timber was specified, or they demonstrated the craft at agricultural fairs, relics of a passing age. By 1920, they were almost gone. By 1950, the craft existed only in historical demonstrations and living history museums, performed by men in period costume for tourists who didn't really understand what they were seeing. The speed won. The cost, won. And something was lost that we're only now beginning to understand. I've visited some of those living history museums. I've watched men demonstrate the broadaxe technique. They're skilled, most of them. They've studied the old methods. They've practiced until they can produce a respectable, squared timber. But they'll tell you, if you ask them, that they're not what the old hewers were. They practice the craft. They don't live it. The difference is in the hands. A colonial-era hewer started as a teenager. He spent years building the specific muscles that broadaxe work requires. His grip strength, his shoulder control, his ability to modulate the swing for different woods and different conditions. His capacity to feel the wood through the handle of the axe. The physical demands were immense. A broadaxe head weighs between 4 and 7 pounds. Swing that thousands of times in a day, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. The shoulders develop in ways that modern people never experience. The forearms become like iron cables. The hands develop calluses so thick they're almost like leather. I've read accounts from doctors who examined old hewers in the late 1800s. They describe hands that could no longer fully straighten, fingers permanently curved from decades of gripping the handle. They describe shoulders that had worn down the cartilage from the repetitive motion. They describe men who couldn't lift their arms above their heads by age 50, but who could still swing an axe with perfect precision. The body adapts to the work, but the work extracts a price. By the time he was a journeyman, a hewer could tell the difference between oak and hickory by the way the blade bit into the grain. He could feel a hidden knot before he hit it. He could sense when a log was about to shift under his weight. He learned to read the grain of the wood, to see where it ran straight and where it twisted, to know which way the chips would fly before he made the cut. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from weekend workshops or summer demonstrations. It comes from doing the same thing thousands of times, year after year, until the tool becomes an extension of your own body, until you don't think about the swing anymore, until the axe just goes where it needs to go. We don't have that anymore. We have people who know about the broadaxe. We have historians and curators and reenactors. But we don't have people who know the broadaxe the way Josiah Barnard knew it, the way William Dunlap knew it, the way Jupiter and Cato knew it. That knowledge is gone. It died with the last generation of working hewers, and it can't be recovered from books. Here's the irony that keeps me thinking about this tool, years after I first started researching it. The beams that Josiah Barnard hewed in 1747 are still holding up that house in Deerfield. 277 years later, they're still doing exactly what they were made to do. The dimensional lumber that replaced broadaxe work, the stuff you can buy at any building supply store today, it has a lifespan of maybe 50 years under optimal conditions. Exposed to moisture, it fails faster. Exposed to stress, it warps and twists and checks and splits. We gained speed. We gained volume. We gained cheap lumber for everyone. Lumber that made it possible to build houses in weeks instead of months. Lumber that expanded the American dream to millions who couldn't have afforded hand-hewn timber. We lost durability. We lost the wood itself, treated with the respect it deserved. We lost a craft that turned trees into structures that could last centuries. And we lost something else, too. Something harder to measure but just as real. We lost the knowledge that quality takes time. That the fastest way to do something is not always the best way. That there's value in a process that can't be rushed or automated or scaled up to industrial production. The broadaxe was slow. One man, one timber, one swing at a time. That slowness was the point. That slowness was what sealed the wood and made it last. We also lost a certain relationship between the worker and the work. A hewer spent hours with a single timber. He knew that piece of wood, knew its quirks and its qualities. He shaped it with his own hands. When it was done, when it was squared and true and ready to be raised into a frame, that timber was his. Not legally, perhaps, but morally. He had made it what it was. Modern workers don't have that relationship. The man who operates a sawmill doesn't know the boards he produces. They come off the line by the thousand, identical, anonymous, destined for customers he'll never meet. There's efficiency in that, certainly. There's productivity. But there's something missing, too. Something that used to give work meaning beyond the paycheck. The broadaxe demanded everything from the men who wielded it. In return, it gave them something to be proud of, something that would last. Last summer I drove through central Vermont, farm country, the kind of landscape that looks like it's been farmland forever, like the fields and pastures and woodlots were always there, just waiting for someone to notice them. They weren't. In 1800, most of what I was driving through was forest. Every cleared field I passed represented someone's struggle to turn trees into open land. Every old barn I saw was built by hand, by men who spent their lives shaping wood with tools their fathers had used before them. I stopped at one of those barns. It was set back from the road, red paint faded to pink, one corner of the roof sagging slightly with age. The owner saw me looking and came out to talk. He told me his great-great-grandfather built it in 1831, built it with his own hands, with help from neighbors who came for the raising. He told me it had never needed major structural repairs. He told me the beams were original, every single one. I asked if I could see them. He took me inside. The barn smelled like hay and old wood, and something else. Something I can only describe as the smell of time passing slowly. The smell of a building that has stood in one place for almost 2 centuries, absorbing the seasons, settling into its foundations, becoming part of the land. The beams were massive, 12 inches by 12 inches, some of them, running the full length of the barn. You could see the broadaxe marks on them, the slight undulations of the hand-hewn surface, each stroke of the blade still visible after all these years. I reached up and touched one. The wood was solid, tight, no give at all. After nearly 2 centuries, it felt like it could hold up another 2. Those timbers were cut from trees that were probably 100 years old when they fell. White oak, most likely, from the forest that used to cover this hillside. They were shaped by a man whose name I'll never know, using a tool that his father probably used before him, standing on those logs in the cold Vermont spring, swinging his broadaxe until the round became flat, and the tree became timber, and the timber became a barn. That man has been dead for more than 150 years. His grave is probably in some small cemetery nearby, the stone worn smooth by weather, the name barely legible. Nobody visits it. Nobody remembers him. But his work remains. His skill remains. The beams he hewed are still holding up this barn, still doing their job, still carrying the weight that he built them to carry. That's what one tool built. Not just structures, a legacy. The broadaxe wasn't just a way to shape wood, it was a way to create something permanent, something that would outlast the hands that made it. The hewers understood this. They knew that the beams they squared would be standing long after they were buried. They took pride in that. They weren't just building barns and houses. They were building monuments to their own skill, even if they never would have used such a grand word for it. We drive through the American landscape today, and we see the results of their work everywhere. We just don't see it as their work. We see old barns, old houses, historical curiosities. We don't see the men who stood on those logs in the freezing cold, swinging their broadaxes, shaping the timber that would carry the weight of centuries. They're forgotten. Their names are lost. Their graves are unmarked or unvisited. But their work remains. Every barn in America that's still standing from before 1870 was built with hand-hewn timber. Every single one. The broadaxe touched every beam, every joist, every rafter. The men who wielded that tool built a nation and then vanished from memory. They were replaced by machines that could work faster and cheaper, machines that produced lumber by the millions of board feet, lumber that built the 20th century and is already failing in the 21st. But the machines couldn't build what they built. The machines couldn't make wood last 200 years. The machines couldn't seal the grain or compress the fibers or create something that would still be standing when their great-great-great-grandchildren drove past on roads that didn't exist when they were alive. One tool did that. One tool and the hands that knew how to use it. The broadaxe built every barn in America that still stands today. And the next time you see one of those barns, sagging a little with age, but still standing, still solid, still carrying its load after all these years, I want you to think about the man who made it possible. He was probably 25 or 30 years old. He probably learned the trade from his father or an uncle or a local master. He probably stood on that log on a morning just like this one, maybe in spring, when the wood was still cold and the sap was just starting to rise. And he swung his broadaxe. Once, twice, 1,000 times, until the round became flat, and the tree became timber, and the timber became a barn that would stand for 2 centuries. He didn't know that. He didn't know his work would still be here in 2024. He was just trying to make a living, just trying to build something solid, just trying to do his job the way he'd been taught to do it. But he built something eternal, something that outlasted him by generations, something that will probably outlast us too. And we owe him more than we can ever repay.